Welcome to the Spawn Chunks, episode number 178 for Monday, January 31st, 2022. My name is Joel Duggan, and joining me, as always, is my friend Johnny, but you may know him better as Chef Pixelriffs. Hello, sir.
Hello, yes, we have been exploring a little bit of food discussion in the pre-show in the render distance, which you can get and listen to in your podcatchers every week if you subscribe to us on Patreon. You can get the extended conversation there every week. We do a little bit pre-show, a little bit post-show, and that's over at patreon.com/thespawnchunks. This is the 5th episode that we've done in this month, so yeah, little bonus right at the end of your January, but I hope everyone's had a good January so far, and rolling into February for the Spawn Chunks, we might have some interesting stuff coming up. We'll have to see, so stay tuned.
I always forget that January has 31 days.
It feels like it shouldn't. It feels like we shouldn't be easing into the year with such a hefty month to kick us off.
And then, like, conversely, February is very short, right?
Yeah.
So, like, so even though January feels long, the winter is the same length. Nothing seems to change. I've been spending a lot of time in modded Minecraft over the week. Do you mind if I just kind of get this off my chest?
Oh, please do. Go for it.
I'm feeling mighty stuck, man. I installed the Tom Simple storage mod in Fabric 5, and I've been looking for the gatekeeper of this mod pack, which is Ender Pearls. And I saw one Enderman, and we couldn't quite get his attention to kill him. In my exploration, I kicked off the stream with some mining, thinking like, well, I'll be down to the deep, dark places. If I see an Enderman, I'll be able to kind of like look at him and get him to come over, and so I can kill him and get the Ender Pearl, just to unlock this one piece that we need to use the storage mod. Because I'm getting to the point now where I'm exploring enough, I'm mining enough, I'm getting enough loot that my storage system has become like a chest monster, and it's like even I don't remember where stuff is. And then layer on top of that, I'm new to all of these mods, and so half of the stuff is brand new to me. And it's like, we need the white spore mushroom. I was like, I'm assuming it's white, but I don't know if I've seen that before. Like, do I have one? Do I need to go get some? Like, I don't know. So that has been feeling kind of stuck. So in a little bit of a frustration, I decided to explore. And herein lies the positive note, which I think you might be able to speak to in terms of 118 as well. I don't think it's just Terralith. Rivers in 118 are awesome.
Yeah, 100% agree. We'll get onto my stories with rivers, but yes, I'm in full agreement.
Man, traveling, you're moving fairly quickly. Boat travel is like zen. You don't have to worry about much. Granted, I have eels in the pack and they will nip at you, but I'm armored to the point now where I'm not going to die, right? But as you're traveling around these rivers, it's cool because you're not just traveling in one straight direction all the time. Like, you can look at your map, another mod, and just see, okay, well, the general direction of the river is east. I'm going to wind around a bit, but that just means I get to see all these new biomes and travel around. So it was really fun to go do that. But again, I'm running into this storage capacity of like, how much of this new stuff can I take? So you think you're going to be exploring for a while, and you realize, well, I've been out here for 10 minutes. We stumbled upon a jungle mansion, so a woodland mansion, but that has spawned in a jungle biome. So it's got a bunch of different blocks. Still has vindicators, the guys with access, right? Yeah, the vindicators and stuff inside, illagers, and but then of course creepers that are super camo, even inside, because it was dark, and so there's all that kind of stuff. And we died a lot. Now, not a big deal, because graves in the pack, you don't lose your stuff. But every time I went back, I had to like grab my backup gear, get a new boat, travel all that way. And on one hand, it became frustrating because I died like 3 times, I think. Pretty sure there's 3 boats on the shore of this.
You end up counting your deaths by just how many vehicles you got parked outside.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then you're just like, and I'm a bit of a pack rat. So like, I don't want to leave anything behind, but you kind of start to choose, like, I don't need more string. I have some string back there. Like I can just take what I really want to take. But the balance of this woodland mansion, and I didn't really get to the upstairs part of it. I was just looting the basement part. And there were tons of chests and lots of bad guys, but the loot was kind of meh.
Yeah.
And in high contrast to the loot that I was getting from this graveyard last week, which was like, wow, like totems of undying and enchanted golden apples and not a bad guy in sight.
Yeah.
So it went from like I feel like I'm taking candy from a baby on one mod to I'm getting my butt handed to me. And I don't know if it's necessarily that different than vanilla, because I've never properly rated a woodland mansion. I think Maccast and I did once upon a time, but it's very different when you're by yourself versus like, you and two other buddies on a server doing it. And it was so long ago. I'm sure it's changed. Like I just don't know how difficult they're really supposed to be. So in terms of like at what stage would you raid a woodland mansion?
Well, funnily, you should ask that because I've just done that. And I think it's honestly weird because the reason to raid a woodland mansion for ages was just to kill evokers to get totems of undying, which now, obviously, in your mods, you're getting in different ways. Now, I think a lot of people would probably do a raid before they bothered actually raiding a woodland mansion. And now it's almost like you don't need to raid a woodland mansion for much in particular. There's a chance to get an enchanted golden apple sometimes. There's you have a really big building once you cleared the whole thing out that you can turn into a base if you want to, but there's not really any unique loot there. Maybe there's a chance of one of the hidden rooms can have a spider spawner in it if you haven't found one of those already, but outside of that, there's really not a great deal to appeal about a woodland mansion these days. And I think the problem you're encountering is that a lot of the mods have been thrown into all of Fabric without much consideration, or probably some consideration, but overall a shrug about the balance of vanilla structures versus modded structures and what some of those things really add to the game in terms of the loot experience. So woodland mansions have started to feel a little bit obsolete for me, even though they're kind of an iconic structure and I don't see them going anywhere. They just sort of have a couple of guaranteed illagers, and that's more or less it for me.
And I don't know whether these illagers were hitting harder than normal because of modded, or I mean, like I'm also not wearing a lot of gear. I couldn't remember if I'm pretty sure I took my backpack off and brought my chest plate in, but I'm still only in iron, or in my case, I guess, rose gold armor, which is technically in this mod pack harder.
Right.
But like stuff like that, I'm just looking for like the easiest way at this point to make the best gear. And so you end up looking like a bit of a hodgepodge, but I did have some enchantments. Like I had, I think protection 3 or something on the chest plate. So, but it just gets frustrating when you're dying so much and then you realize that the loot is just like, well, this wasn't worth it. But it was closer to the end of the stream. And I ended up kind of like, I don't want to say rage quit because that has a real different connotation, but I was definitely ready to go and do something else. But the way that I looked at it and the positive that I took out of it was that it would have been way more frustrating, and I would have been probably obviously angered if I had been walking back. But because of the boats, because of the rivers, because of the access, it really didn't take that long. And your whole row back to your grave, you didn't have to worry about getting hit by a single bad guy that's going to kill you. Because you've got either no gear or very little gear. And really, it was a very easy way to get back. It was a very, despite the repetition of doing it a couple of times, when I start to get bored. It was still like, okay, well, the fact that these rivers are this traversable is fantastic because it makes this corpse run way more palatable than it would have been otherwise.
Yeah, I found a couple of really interesting places where rivers effectively make lakes, and that's the coolest part of them to me, is rivers are a much more accessible way of getting around now. They're wider. Even the frozen rivers where you're boating on top of ice and traveling about 1,000 miles an hour, those are now large enough that you can do that without skidding off onto the snow at the side of the river every couple of blocks, and it's much more rewarding. It's very satisfying doing that. And I found that out because I was exploring my 118 world a little bit more. I found a snow plains that was about 5,000 blocks away from spawn. I just picked a direction. I think even my Twitch chat picked a direction for me, and I just went east for as far as we felt like going. And that's where I stumbled upon the Woodland Mansion. Instead of seeking it out using one of those explorer maps, I just happened upon it, which is probably the first time that's happened. But yeah, traveling there by boats, over oceans, over rivers, you stumble upon really interesting configurations of the scenery. And rivers, if they double back on themselves, can create these kind of especially if it's like surrounded by this sort of natural basin forming out of the hills around it, can really feel like a nice lake area that you could build stuff all around and even have a town coming out onto the lake if you're thinking like, Dale and Esgaroth in Lord of the Rings and that kind of stuff. Like there's so much cool stuff you can do with terrain like that you'd have to have a small like inland ocean biome in previous updates for that to really generate the same way. Right, so I think rivers generally have been fantastic in 118, and props to the team for making them that way, because it's a lot more fun, a lot more coherent getting around that way.
I also like how much of an obstacle they are from getting from one side to the other. Like it's not like most of the time in the older generation, it'd be 5 or 6 blocks wide, 3 blocks deep. Like it's really not a pain in the butt to just jump in, because you kind of jump in, swim 2 strokes, and jump out the other side. But now, because of how deep rivers tend to be, because of how wide they are in some locations, or sometimes how close they can get with different landscapes on either side, they just beg to be bridged. Like they beg for something to be built there and for a reason to cross at that particular section, or they want to be bridged because you are so sick and tired of going across them early game without depth strider on your boots. And I like that. I like that they offer like a mode of travel, but then also build opportunities, and they've become, I think, cooler to look at too. Like it's cool when you're looking at a river and it goes down 5 or 6 blocks, like right from the shore. I
Yeah,
find that it looks much more interesting, especially because you can see seagrass and fish and stuff swimming around. Like I think
yeah.
that's a much better experience as far as a player goes.
There are massive drop-offs in some of the rivers that I've been in valleys that lead through, roofed forest on either side, like dark oak trees coming
Nice.
up around you, and it feels a lot more atmospheric. And then, there's also, even with the changes to light level spawning, there's now the opportunity for drowned to spawn further down in the river, and like it generates a lot of interest, that kind of stuff, where previously so many of the rivers in default generation were just samey. Like you knew what you were going to get from a river basically every time. So I think it's a massive change. Some other massive changes I'm getting used to is powder snow, or rather avoiding powder snow. And I've been exploring some of these snowier areas, I've stumbled into more mountainous regions, more groves, more snowy slopes, and I find myself, instead of maybe what you'd think of as the intended way of switching to leather boots to walk on powdered snow, I've just been avoiding it, and I've just gotten used to recognizing, oh, that doesn't have snow layers on top of it, it's probably just, that section there is probably powder snow. Let me try and find a way around it, as though I'm walking around, a lava lake or something equally as dangerous. And I'm at the point where I'm just getting used to avoiding it rather than troubling myself to switch to leather boots and bringing leather boots with me all the time. And I'm thinking about this now because Bedrock Edition has the functionality where you can have armor on your hotbar. If you right-click with the armor in your hand, you can just instantly swap that piece of armor with whatever you're wearing. And so Bedrock players might be able to just put those boots on the fly if they've got them in, like, slot 7 or 8 of your hotbar or whatever, right? So I would love that to be in Java Edition, and I think that would encourage me to actually use the powder snow thing a lot more and travel on powder snow. And as it was, I put the boots on just to experience, oh, I can walk on powder snow, and you can use it to even like go up and down as though it's like a scaffolding block or an elevator kind of thing. And then I just never really bothered with it again. So
Yeah.
I'm finding that there's sort of interesting sides to exploring the new terrain and what you actually bother with interacting with at this stage.
My reaction to powdered snow is kill it with fire.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've been really, because I wear netherite boots because they got high durability, and I've got lots of feather falling enchantments and stuff on them, because I just jump off of stuff. The joke on my streams is usually like, "Oh, your poor ankles,"
Yeah.
and as a result, I don't want to have to switch boots. Like I already have to sacrifice a helmet if I go to the Nether, and I have to wear a gold helmet so I don't get bugged by piglins. Not that it would be a big deal in our established Nether hub, but still, like you don't want to have that one shot piglin that you didn't realize was there. And is in exploring the 118 mountains that we've added to the server, many of us are voicing our frustrations with the powdered snow. When you just want to go and explore and build and be end game for your Minecraft server, 4.5 year Minecraft server, and you're constantly being like slowly, it's not like you're going to die. Like I've got enough armor and health and food that's not going to kill me, but like my exploration has come, it's like it's brought to a grinding halt as you
Yeah.
sink 4 blocks into powdered snow. And you're just like, oh, now I have to destroy the landscape and get out of here. And you might as well have creeper holes everywhere. And for us, it's been really frustrating. And the consensus have been like, it would be nice if some sort of like end game enchantment or something that's really harder to get, that you could put on maybe only netherite boots, or just something that would allow you to have the same sort of like aqua affinity, not aqua affinity, depth strider sort of ability, but in powdered snow, whether that's frostwalker, whatever that is,
Yeah.
to be able to just get up and get out of it. Because like, you think like as an end game player, like I've got beacons and netherite gear and elytra, and like I'm owning this world, but snow is like
The bane of
bringing
your
me to a
existence.
grinding
Yeah.
halt. So
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
and I find that kind of strange. So I feel like there should be some sort of solution for, I mean, I get it. Leather boots make sense early on. You have to choose between leather and iron, and that helps with your exploration as you're walking around. That's cool. I mean, it's a cool mechanic for early game, but I find that with a lot of these mechanics that they've been adding lately, they don't really consider like how the end game player that has worked very hard to basically feel like God and rule this world, you know, that you've been spending all this time in, um, to then just like, by the way, feathers can kill you. And you're like, what? You
Yeah.
know, like that kind of stuff feels a little bit strange.
Yeah, it's
But
it's it's kind of an interesting balance. Like you've got to still have some hazards at a certain point in the game,
yeah,
but like it's whether those things are really hazards or whether they're just kind of like vaguely irritating. Like it's almost there to troll us rather than actually cause us serious harm at this point.
right.
So that may be the intention. And obviously there are many other uses for powdered snow once you harness it for your own ends. And we might talk a little bit more about that in the news actually, because I know some Bedrock players have been talking about the merits of powdered snow lately. But then yeah, there's just some irritation to be handled there. I think is the main problem.
Well, speaking of problems, one of the other things that I've been tackling on the Citadel has been the addition of this parade square and the guard quarters, or you know, captain of the guard quarters that I'm adding to the front of the build, and it has meant that I have to adjust the curtain wall and how the whole thing attaches. And it's time consuming, but I've made some decent progress. I've got kind of like the main shapes and some of the building attachments kind of mapped out now. I haven't done the textures, I haven't done the final blocks, but like the basic color palette, and I mean, surprise, it's brown and gray,
Mm-hmm.
are there. But it was really fun to edit the something in the town that I wasn't happy with, which was the shape of the curtain wall.
Yeah.
It's not 100% like exactly how I'd like it. It's going to be one of those things where I probably have to like take some losses and be like, okay, well, it's not perfect, but like it's my first crack at something like this. So it's not going to all go exactly how you have planned. However, I feel much better about it than I did before, and ran into even some happy accidents where I had planned this like 2 building structure with a large kind of like peak roof hall and then a tower. And the tower is tall enough that you can have a second floor to it. And as a result, the terrain also gets higher about that spot. And so we have this staircase that goes up. So rather than the curtain wall gradually getting higher, which is very hard to make look good when you're dealing with a battlement, the fact that Minecraft is so blocky, and you're going at an angle, but then also increasing in height. And the solution is go straight up
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
in a staircase. And so that's happy accident. This little courtyard ended up being something that I could raise on one side. And now to get up to the second level of the wall, which is on top of the hill, you just go up a set of stairs.
Mm-hmm.
And so stuff like that has been coming together nicely. I've managed to smooth out the wall. It's looking a lot better now. I'm still concerned about some large sections that are pretty flat, but most of the time it's good. I've not done anything like, you know, make it look like it's part of the landscape or finish the texture. Like it's all just basically like, here are the broad strokes of this area, but really happy with the way that it's coming out. It's nice to kind of take some ideas and kind of like move into a new section of town. The build is feeling fresh and new, despite the fact that I've been on it for about a year.
Yeah, that's good. That's always a good feeling when you think this should be getting stale, but I keep finding new stuff to keep it fresh. That's always nice.
So with keeping stuff fresh, have you done any like multiplayer stuff? Because I know you've been doing so much survival guide.
Yeah, I've been part of Clash of the Creators again this month, which has been super fun. I had a a bit of a hectic time last night when me, Cubfan, Ellie Beatmaker, and the guy 1604 were in January's Clash of the Creators as a team. This was my 10th time doing Clash of the Creators, which only really discovered that after the fact. But this was another 2-hour event. We're getting vanilla advancements in Minecraft 1.17, but with a data pack that Plagiatus had written himself, but I think there are other versions of it publicly available. I think Seth Bling did this originally, and then somebody else kind of took up the reins after that. But all of the loot tables had been randomized, and that's not just like loot tables for chests and stuff. All blocks, basically, I'm learning this, all blocks have a loot table. All loot chests, all mobs, they have a loot table behind the scenes. And so, with all of that being randomized, if you broke a grass block, it didn't drop a grass block. It dropped something else. And then whatever it dropped, if it was like, say, for example, a block of blue wool, you could break that, and it would turn into something else. And so instead of the items dropping themselves and being able to like harvest a bunch of wood to make our first crafting tables and stuff, we were scrambling around trying to figure out what made cobblestone. And if you broke a block of stone, it gave you a block of honey. And there was there's these bizarre like switches. And of course, all of the teams had the same stuff, and the blocks were always consistent. So a block of dirt would always drop a block of blue wool, and llamas would always drop something from the wither skeleton loot table and stuff like that. So this made the whole process a little bit more chaotic at first as we were trying to, exchange information. Pretty quickly, we discovered that if you broke tall seagrass, it gave you a blue orchid. If you broke a blue orchid, it gave you an entire block of diamond. So we all basically started out with full diamond gear within about the first 5 minutes. And from there, it was fine because we had all of the stuff we needed to break the different blocks, and it was just figuring out what was what and what could lead to advancements being available. And because there's some stuff like taming a horse, for example, just requires you to find a horse. You don't actually need any resources for it. But then there are various other things that you need to, acquire cobblestone and sticks so that you can make a cobblestone pickaxe, which is normally one of the first things you do. That happened about an hour into this event after we'd already got like 50 other advancements. So it was chaotic, but it was very, very fun. And an interesting insight into how loot tables actually work. So I'll try and find the randomizer that I found this just to kind of check out how it worked beforehand. It won't be the exact same thing, but I think it was by Fazguy. Yeah, fazguy.net and /Minecraft_randomizer will get you that. I will leave a link to that in the show notes as well. But it's a riot. It's a Java data pack that you can install on a fresh 1.17 or 1.18 world. I think you can even do it for older versions and the newest versions as well. But not recommended for your everyday, like, I play this all the time vanilla world. Like, you'll want to start a fresh one. But it's a trip. It's very, very fun. And yeah, recommended if you need something as a light distraction from the usual Minecraft, and if you just want to like run around chaotically punching chickens to see what loot they drop.
It sounds like one of those situations where you have to unlearn what you have learned.
Yeah, in a way, although you have to retain certain elements of what you've learned for like remembering, oh yeah, I need cobblestone in order to craft a dispenser, or like, once you find a target block, like you need to find the thing that drops a redstone so you can put together the cheesy way of getting the bullseye advancement and stuff like that. So it was a fun mix of just reacting to stuff when we didn't know what was going to happen, and okay, how do we actually apply our Minecraft knowledge to this?
Right.
So yeah, a really fun event.
With stuff like that, like, how were you communicating all verbally, or were you keeping notes in game, like, blue orchid equals diamond block? I mean, that's easy to remember, but like,
yeah,
once you get like 6, 8, 12 recipes like that, like, were you writing them all down in the game somewhere?
No, we just ended up sharing information verbally, trying to remember the stuff that gave us specific things. And honestly, if we'd been more organized about it, it would have been a lot better. We still ended up winning, which was great. But like, I think if we'd kept like, if not a like a written record, then maybe just like put down a bunch of blocks in the sequence that they would change, so like if you find like a grass block gives you blue wool, and then the blue wool gives you a daylight sensor, and the daylight sensor gives you a flower, and the flower gives you something else, just put all of those things in a line so you can see where in the sequence a specific resource was. That would have worked out. But because the teams were randomized as well as part of the event, we didn't really have much time to strategize except on the fly. So in the end, we just ended up running around like headless chickens for the most part, trying to just punch everything to see what it did. But very, very fun. Would absolutely do another event like that with different advancements or something, because it was chaos in the best possible way.
See, I always find myself a bit intimidated by events like that, because while I've been playing the game for a long time, I'm the one asking the chat room, what's the recipe for the grindstone again?
Yeah.
I'm that guy. But stuff like this would even the playing field dramatically, I would think.
Yeah, I think the weirdest part was just how full your inventory got of useless blocks, but then you were keeping them all on them because they might turn into something useful again later, and you just weren't sure what was what. So I ended up stockpiling wood just so I could bring a bunch of crafting tables with me, because every time you put down a crafting table to craft something, if you broke it, it turned into something else. So you ended up not being able to bring like the basic things. Like I think we struggled to find what made a furnace for a really long time. And yeah, there was some pretty wild stuff in there. It was hilarious in so many ways, but had a great time doing it.
Moving on to the news this week, we have a beta in the Bedrock edition. It's beta 1.18.20.21, and you can find a link to that in our show notes as well. Frogs now jump more frequently. Frog eggs have been renamed to frog spawn. The time for frog spawn to hatch into tadpoles has been increased. Tadpole hitbox is now larger. Frog spawn has a new texture. Frogs in meadow biomes are now temperate variants. They've tweaked the frog's jump and tongue animations. In the Create a New World menu, the Create New World screen has been given a new design and is now available for some players. Vanilla Parity, worlds can now be created with a 64-bit seed with a value of negative 9.2 quintillion up to positive 9.2 quintillion, and those can be copied between Bedrock and Java to produce the same world. Non-numeric seed UI inputs now produce the same seeds as Java Edition.
Yeah, and there's a bunch of other stuff in that changelog as well, but I thought we could do like a cut down version of it that isn't just all of the minor tweaks and bug fixes. But the headline news, I think, here, even though it's buried under the information about frogs being slightly different, is seed parity. Because as somebody who's obviously been a Java player for a while and is used to having to give Bedrock players the bad news that the worlds that I'm putting in my videos aren't going to be available to them on Bedrock because of the way Bedrock terrain generates differently. Hugely excited about the fact that there is now 64-bit seed parity, because people have sent me screenshots of the current survival guide world, which would previously have generated totally differently terrain on Bedrock Edition. And it's running in the most recent beta, and they're showing me landmarks from like, oh, here's that waterfall that you turned into your first wheat farm, and like, do you recognize this cave and that kind of stuff? And I'm like, yes, finally. This is probably only going to affect a small handful of players on balance, the people who care about their worlds being transferable between Bedrock and Java. But for those people, it is the world. It is massive. And hats off to the team for pursuing this as a change, and hopefully just having that initial, 32-bit seed parity was the catalyst for them being able to do more of that, and it didn't, end up being a huge labor to do that. But what a change. And I'm just incredibly happy that at last, if you give a Bedrock player and a Java player the same seed number, they'll get the same world. That's incredible to me.
Now, to clarify, this isn't necessarily like a saved game. Like, you can't play in Bedrock for a couple months and then transfer that world to Java.
Yeah, right? It's not like that kind of thing. It's much more just whatever you give the terrain generation algorithm, it will produce the same basic results. And there may still be some changes, as far as I'm aware, in positions of stuff like structures. If the Bedrock terrain generator doesn't think that a pillager outpost could spawn there, then it won't put one there necessarily. But there is still some parity in that as well. I think they showed that up to, the release of 1.18. They said like, yeah, we're sneaking in a couple of structures end up in the same places. Like the shipwrecks might generate slightly differently, but they'll generate in the same places. They'll just be a different configuration of the same landmark. And
Right.
yeah, there's some stuff like that is actually meshing now. And so if I direct people to a woodland mansion in the Survival Guide World Seed, it might end up being in the same place in Bedrock. And that's, yeah, mind-blowing to me.
Yeah, I had a similar discussion on stream on the weekend, and the general kind of consensus was that, like, with so many Minecraft content creators um playing on Java Edition, this is just such a nice parity to have, because it brings the Bedrock players, which would be the majority of the player base, um, closer to that experience if they wanted to explore or mimic or contribute to the content that they see online.
The other thing I've noticed Bedrock Edition players mentioned this week, which was kind of downplayed in this the changelog for this Bedrock Edition beta, but the hitboxes of coral fans are slightly different, or like mobs no longer see coral fans as something that they can walk over. And this is the equivalent on Bedrock Edition of trapdoors being able to like trick mobs into walking over them for mob farms. And there's been a bit of back and forth with the developers on Twitter about this, because they've said that ideally powdered snow is the kind of thing that you're supposed to use for mob farms like this, because mobs will just freely walk over it, they'll fall down through the powdered snow, and then that's how you can have your mob farm work. And a few players have pushed back about this because, for a start, powder snow slows things down. Like, if you have mobs falling through powder snow, it's not as slow as falling through cobwebs, but it's definitely slower than them just dropping straight through a shaft into whatever killing mechanism you have, right? But the other thing is, some mobs, if you're playing on harder difficulties, will spawn with equipment, and sometimes that means your zombies, your skeletons are going to spawn with leather boots. And those mobs have the same immunity to powder snow traps as players do when they're wearing leather boots, in that they don't fall through them at all, which means ultimately your mob farm ends up stopping working. And with Bedrock Edition having lower mob spawn rates than Java to begin with, this is frustrating a lot of players who like to take the technical approach to Bedrock. Thankfully, this morning I noticed a bit of a tweet from Megaspud, who's one of the folks who shares a little bit more of the tech kind of back and forth on Bedrock Edition, saying that they're kind of open to feedback about a lot of this stuff. The changes that they're making to some of this stuff have either been like reverted, or they're just listening to player feedback and seeing what's going to work best for other players, and just trying to get the best of both worlds for Bedrock players, really. So it's good to know that the Bedrock team is open to that, because a lot of advocacy from the Java community has led to a lot of bugs being fixed that then ended up getting reverted or made like more formally into features, thanks to the Java community saying, like, we still want quasi-connectivity to be in the game, we still want certain mob behaviors to be there because we rely on them for certain things. Even the back and forth that happened about iron farms during the 1.14 update snapshots was just an example of how the community can still have the game that they want to play through that kind of dialogue with the developers. So the situation is ongoing. Not going to report it as a formal news item, but just thought it was something to keep an eye on as the betas for Bedrock continue to roll out.
Does powdered snow melt in the Nether?
It doesn't, I don't believe, because I think ice is the only thing that does, and then it sort of evaporates, but then powder snow doesn't turn into water, so I think it's kind of exempt from that behavior. I've definitely seen people using powder snow to break their fall in the Nether, because that you can place it like a water bucket in the overworld. As you fall, you can place it on the block below you. And I guess that usually involves, grabbing it in the bucket again and running off with it, so it's not there for long enough to see whether it melts or not. But I don't believe it does. Don't quote me on that, but I don't think so.
I'm just saying, like, with trapdoors and mob farms and stuff like that, if they removed that feature, then and powdered snow was not something that worked in the Nether, then all those mob farms wouldn't work at the Nether, right? So you'd have to have the powdered snow. I mean, one advantage, I think, and this I do remember, is that hot mobs like magma cubes, I think zombie pigmen, like anything in the Nether, take more damage from powdered snow, if I recall. Blazes, like anything that's like a fire mob takes more damage from powdered snow than the average zombie in the overworld.
Yeah, it says I'm on the Minecraft wiki for this now, because I was looking up the Nether properties. It says fire-related mobs like striders, magma cubes, and blazes take 5 points of damage, so like 2.5 hearts from freezing damage, instead of like half a heart every couple of seconds.
Right. So I mean that's so cool. If you want to use it for a specific use in the Nether, then that's good. But yeah, if it messes up the timing of your farm, and so many of these farms have like a very technical, so many mobs dropping out to make sure that the spawn rates increase and all that kind of stuff. Like if it's too slow for that, then it's not a viable solution.
Yeah, it also says it's broken by water or lava or even shot with a flame enchanted bow. So if you fire a flaming arrow into this, if you're a skeleton and you spot something that you want to attack, then if you got a flame bow, then that means you can destroy blocks of powdered snow. So again,
Right.
there are potentially some fail safes you'd need in the farm, although you probably wouldn't be within range of the skeleton's aggro anyway. But there's just a couple of little technical things that make powdered snow a little bit more impractical, and it's interesting to see the changes that the developers want to make to player behavior and players' overall reactions to that. I think we're also seeing the same thing in Java Edition right now with King B-Dogs and a couple of other folks tweeting about how Skulk is going to be used as XP storage and is ultimately going to be the solution to fixing the zombie pigman aggro bug, because zombie pigmen are still going to give you XP when you kill them right now, because the aggression behavior makes them think that they're being killed by a player when they get killed by whatever, and that's how gold farms work and give you a ton of XP in the process. But with Skulk, it's a way of storing that XP in block form, so if the mob dies, then it generates more Skulk blocks, and mining those gives the player XP, but there's still like a middleman process in there, which is mining the Skulk blocks up to get the XP. So interesting to see some of these mechanics developing a little bit more and changing to fit the developer's vision and finding solutions to stuff that has been a bug for a while, but it's something that players end up relying on. With that out of the way, let's move on to chunk mail. We got a couple in this week, and one of them is going to, I think, lead into our main discussion, really. So this first one is completely separate. This comes in from Tim S., who is a landscape artist member of our Discord. Thank you so much for writing in. The subject is in-game learning. Hello, Joel and Johnny. I've taken my first steps into the world of Redstone and have quite enjoyed the puzzle-solving aspects of a Redstone build. That said, I find myself often referring to the wiki to understand the basic components and simple Redstone circuits. While watching Joel's All of Fabric 5 VODs, I noticed that many mods include a manual by combining a book with a special ingredient. For example, to get the manual for the Botania mod, the player combines a book with a sapling. What if there was a redstone manual in vanilla Minecraft by combining a book with redstone dust, or a manual for enchanting even by combining a book with lapis? Do you think this would fit within Minecraft? Tim suffocated by triggering the wrong piston. It's happened to us all, Tim. No shame in it.
I love this idea because it's one of the things that I really like about some of the better mods that I've experienced in All of Fabric 5, which is once you realize that the manual is something that you can craft in the game from WUD that knowledge then becomes like, oh, okay, if I'm frustrating or having a hard time with this mod, does it have a book? So that you can use roughly enough items, to look up the book, which is a little bit of, it's like an extension of the in-game Minecraft recipe book. But I really like this idea for vanilla Minecraft. I think that it keeps players in the game rather than going to the wiki. And it could provide some really interesting opportunities for, we'll call it Minecraft lore, whatever the main Bible is that we don't know, at Mojang for the lore of the world and the rules that they set up for themselves in terms of what they communicate to the players. I think it would be really cool to, either craft it yourself or have it be something in a loot table from a dungeon or shipwreck or something like that. That's fairly easy to get. Because it would just provide the player with that much more knowledge, especially if it wasn't even something that was heavily worded, which I know in some cases, like comparators and things like that, you might want to go that route for. But imagine a redstone book in Minecraft that's like a Lego instruction manual, right? Just pictures, cool pixel art, some opportunities for some awesome art from the Minecraft team to go into this book that you can flip through. Pictures help it transcend language barriers around the world. Like, it could be really, really fun to do that. Now, I would say that in some ways that kind of breaks my experience and some of the things that brought me even farther into the Minecraft world, which was looking things up on YouTube. So weirdly, I find the wiki immersion breaking. But when I'm not playing the game and I need to go watch some YouTube stuff to learn about Redstone, to watch players like Mumbo or Nembon or whatever, I find that that makes me feel like I'm more of the Minecraft collective experience, not less,
Yeah.
right? It's more community based. And so I understand that they don't want to remove that either. But I think that, a Redstone basics book would have helped me out considerably when I was learning how to do this stuff. Because without YouTube, I would have no clue what to do with Redstone. None.
Yeah. Yeah, I kind of take the opposite approach to this. I'm looking at it from a different perspective here, but like I think practical examples are a much easier way for me to learn things than reading about them. And I always make this argument whenever somebody asks me to make a video about the individual redstone components, is that I can explain what it does, but that doesn't necessarily explain how to use them.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Minecraft, if it was providing an instruction manual for Redstone, would have to impose certain ideas upon the player that the game itself does not necessarily want to. And it's players who are coming up with the idea for making, a sugarcane farm out of redstone components, for example. But they're not doing that necessarily by thinking through, this is what this component does in a vacuum. You know what I mean? So I think for Minecraft to show you practical examples of how redstone can be used, it needs to do that in the form of stuff like generated structures. So like I recently raided a jungle temple, and one of the things I didn't take into account, I sort of took for granted at the time, but thinking back on it now is quite significant, is how for some players that might serve as an introduction to certain redstone components. If you think about what's
Right.
in a jungle temple, even though it's not very interesting for the average player who's just there to loot the room, you've got tripwires, you've got redstone activated arrow dispensers, there's a concealed door with a repeater and 3 sticky pistons, and a bunch of levers and stuff like that. The jungle temple is basically a sort of redstone lab, more or less. And if you want to pull it apart and see what it does, then you can do a ton of stuff with that. The thing is, a lot of players now don't need to rely on that because they have the resources available to them via YouTube and the internet. And so if they want to look up a 2x2 door design with pistons, then they're not looking to a jungle temple, they're looking to Mumbo Jumbo or whoever. And personally, I think the practical examples that you get from stuff like jungle temples are one way of presenting that information without giving players a bunch of literature to read. Even if it's like pictograms and stuff, like it feels a little bit strange for the tone of Minecraft. And if it was straight up written language, if there was a bunch of literature to read, I would probably tune that out instantly. Like, I find reading about redstone components themselves on the Minecraft wiki completely impenetrable. It's just not the way my brain works. And
Yeah.
the language of redstone often ends up feeling kind of esoteric to the point where you think, like, the player should have a baseline level knowledge of, like, electronics before you even get started. As soon as somebody starts talking about logic gates and uses phrases like, the XOR gate and the RS NOR latch and the T flip-flop, like, my brain just switches off. Like, I can't handle that stuff. Even when somebody's trying to leave a helpful comment on my YouTube videos, it doesn't process for me. So I kind of wonder if there are ways of the game presenting that stuff to you in the form of a practical example, like, in the same way that the igloo teaches you to de-zombify villagers. Like, if it can just give you the components and say, solve this simple puzzle, and then, it gives you a repeater that you set the timing to a certain delay, and that's what unlocks a hidden door in the structure or something like that. I think doing stuff like that and giving players effectively a small puzzle is going to be a lot more effective than telling them, well, a repeater can delay the signal by this amount of in-game ticks. And you just sort of go, well, what do I do with that? I think showing somebody how to do something is going to be more effective than telling them, in a way.
Especially with redstone being used for farming certain things and collecting certain things, you kind of wonder whether there could be an opportunity there to add some very small, very simple redstone farming components to villages. Like have a farmer use a piston for something, or even if it's just showing like a hopper going into a chest underneath a composter, right?
Yeah.
Like just like little things like that could be cool to illustrate to the player. I flip flop on this. Like on one hand, like I like having a solid instruction manual. I'm a very visual person in that way. But then because I'm thinking about pictures. Like I'm thinking mostly about pictures with this, but I understand the point about having stuff in world and having like here's a very small scale version of what this block composition of redstone components can do. But if you want to do something cool with it, like here's the concept. Now use your imagination and create a sugar cane farm that's 26 blocks long, and whatever you
Hmm.
want to do, that
Yeah.
kind of stuff. Um, One of the things that I've seen a lot lately, because I've been watching some modded on YouTube, is the create mod that doesn't necessarily have an instruction manual, but in the mod it provides some animated on-screen kind of like composition of components. Because it is such a complex mod, there's lots of moving parts and rotations and gears and things. They provide you with an example of how this component works, not necessarily how to build a thing, but it's like, this is a conveyor belt and it takes items from one place to another. It goes up and down. And so once you get that concept, you start to test it in the world. Like, how far up and down can it go? Like, what does it go at angles? Can I do straight up or straight down? Like, there's a lot of stuff that can be explored there. But I like the fact that it gives you that visual kind of like animated, this is how these components go together. This is the end result. But I don't know if Minecraft Redstone is so complex that it needs that. I'd imagine that's something more unique to Create Mod, just because it is such a very complex mod.
Yeah, and there are certain things which are designed to have more or less one purpose. And
Yeah.
the thing about Redstone is it's like you're giving people the building blocks and expecting them to create something bigger out of that, rather than giving them like a fully realized component and saying this is designed for one thing specifically.
Yeah.
And that's the difficulty, is like, yeah, providing effectively just a series of components that the player can put together into something more interesting. The other thing I've noticed Mojang doing, and this may be perhaps part of the design philosophy creeping in now, like the consideration of making stuff like this when it's fresh in the game more accessible. I've seen footage and now a couple of screenshots of the upcoming ancient cities that are part of the Deep Dark, which have redstone lamps in some of them. And people have speculated, although I don't think it appears in the video itself, that those have hidden skulk sensors maybe on top of the redstone lamp, so that when the player walks nearby, it sends a redstone signal to the redstone lamp, and that turns it on because the skulk sensor is detecting your footsteps. And people have speculated, hey, that's just a way of showing players that skulk sensors output a redstone signal. Because when you would encounter them, they're an alarm system for the warden, and that's how they appear in the environment, right? But what you don't realize is that you can then take that somewhere else, put it in your redstone contraption, and you have a player detector, and then it combines with a comparator to have all of these different output. Depending on what the sound effect is nearby, it'll output a different range of signals. And like the amount of that you would have to explain in an instruction manual for what a skulk sensor is completely breaks the law, compared to just putting it in the city somewhere that it can activate an innocuous redstone lamp, and then give the players the idea of like, oh, maybe that has a redstone interaction, let me see what else I can do with that, and letting the player's own behavior snowball the interaction with the skulk sensor, the component, from there. Obviously, that's not going to teach you all of the stuff that a comparator does, but I think the problem with older redstone components is that they've been in the game for so long that those sort of considerations weren't really around when they were just throwing cool stuff into the game for people to work with. And more advanced redstone components came up, there wasn't really a way to introduce that stuff to the player other than just having them talk about it and play around with it, and community knowledge spreading what that was. So I think now they're considering a lot more, if a player is coming to this without any previous knowledge of redstone, how do we indicate to somebody that this is a redstone component? So it's interesting to see that, and I wonder how that's going to affect the addition of future components if we get some in forthcoming updates.
Skulk is a really good example. Yeah, I would agree with you that the way that they implemented it, or the idea that that's how they're implementing it and showing the player that it puts out a signal, is much better than having to read, because it's such a complex addition.
Yeah.
To the blocks. I'm glad you brought up lore, because I'm curious about what you think of the other part of Tim's question, which was about having a tome or a manual that would explain enchanting. Um, like, is this the same? Does you have the same sort of opinion? Like, do you think it's better to just explore the enchantments, or do you think that they need some explanation?
I think a lot of stuff about enchanting becomes intuitive, and I don't say that lightly because obviously there's a certain amount of it that still feels fairly complex, but the stuff that feels complex is getting the enchantments that you want and knowing exactly what's out there. And that's the kind of stuff that can be done with a reasonable amount of trial and error. I think when it comes to setting up an enchantment table, obviously, like, knowing that you have to put a certain amount of bookshelves around it to get a better enchantment is one thing, but there are, like, environmental storytelling clues going on there. Like, the enchantment table has a book open on the top of it, so, like, if you put a bookshelf nearby, it kind of goes together with the theme of it. If you open it up, it's got a slot for lapis where it's quite clearly kind of outlined, the sprite for lapis is, and you kind of think, oh, okay, there's something else I can put in here, let me try certain things. There's enough trial and error, I think, in enchanting that can lead to you happening upon various different enchantments that are actually useful to the player ultimately. And there aren't really any bad enchantments, there are just enchantments that we know we want, having played through the game with a bit more experience now. Whereas with Redstone, I feel like it's much more open-ended. Enchanting is a closed system. You know, you can't really experiment much more with enchanting than just enchanting some tools and combining some things. Whereas Redstone is a much more broad topic. So enchanting, I don't think, needs it necessarily, unless the system somehow gets a lot more complex further down the line.
So I had experienced confusion when I was first getting into Minecraft and was dealing with enchantments, because I had seen a little bit maybe on YouTube, but like as I was getting into it myself, like I didn't know what half of the stuff did. I mean, like some things are self-explanatory, like sharpness on a sword. Like I've played enough video games in my life to go, okay, that's good.
Yeah.
I want that probably, you know. But then you get like aqua affinity. Sure, sounds good. What does it do? Why do I want it? Like, should I be spending money, you know, my hard-earned levels and lapis on aqua affinity, or should I be getting protection on my helmet? Like what, like, I kind of wish that there was a little bit of an explainer as to what it would do, you know? And again, something that could be done with pictures, or something that could be done with a tome. I don't find that putting 15 bookshelves around an enchanting table is at all intuitive. Like if I didn't see that done in a video, would have never put that together on my own. So that kind of stuff, especially like even if you just came across an enchanting table somewhere in the world that had like those little glyphs kind of floating off of it, you know, and putting it into like showing it happening, then you're like, oh, if I do that, or if I transport all this home with me, then it'll do the same thing at my base, and it'll work out. So I like the idea of having some sort of, in-game book, especially because the enchantment table has a book on top of it. Maybe even it's just as simple as, I mean, like you right click on the enchanting table, maybe it just has like a recipe book in it, or you can read the book, and it just kind of says, oh, you want to come, you want these kind of enchantments, or here are an explanation of what they do.
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes you have to just look it up, because like something about like, bane of arthropods. It's like, well, I know what an arthropod is, so I kind of can put two and two together. But like that kind of stuff, I find when it gets into very specific things. The biggest question that I had, which I had long into my early game Minecraft experience, was, okay, feather falling 2 better, but then feather falling 1. But is 3 the most? Why there's 4, but there's only sharpness 3? No, is there sharpness 4? Like knowing where to stop. Like when do you know, oh, that's the best, that's the one I should get. And knowing that it doesn't go any higher, they don't communicate that very well either, I find.
Yeah, I think that's much more about, again, experimentation, and like if you combine an enchanted book with gear you've already got, if you notice that if you add a Feather Falling 4 book to Feather Falling 4 boots, it doesn't then produce something that says Feather Falling 5. I guess that's the only indication you have. But I think enchanting is another one of those systems that's just old enough by now that they didn't really introduce it in a way that wasn't just directly communicated to the player. and players have just been able to pass that knowledge on. But yeah, it's the slippery slope of like, at what point do we signpost every mechanic in the game and tell you exactly how it works? I'm curious to see what people's feedback is about that, because it'd be interesting to know how much hand holding you want in Minecraft and how much you're expected to experiment and look things up and whatnot.
So our next email is going to spark the main discussion for the show. Do you want to read this one?
Oh, sure, yeah, this comes in from Nightlaw09, and the subject is survival tips for large builds. Hi, Johnny and Joel, I love the show. Although I've played Minecraft since the 1.14 update, I'm very new to the concept of building in-game and where I want to improve. I want to take on building a castle, but where I get stuck is where to even get started. Most building tutorials on YouTube seem to be in creative mode. Can you offer any advice or tips for the survival player on how to effectively lay out, plan, visualize, and actually start a large-scale building project when you're dealing with things like terrain challenges, height differences, block palettes, etc.? Should I just go out there with my colored wool and get to work? Do you recommend scaffolding or not? Any insight you can provide would be much appreciated. Nightlaw09 hit the ground too hard falling off his scaffolding while trying to reach a castle roof. So yeah, we decided this should be our main discussion this week. It kind of builds on what we what we were discussing last week when it came to like approaching build projects, where you build your base and that kind of stuff. So it seemed like a nice topic for this week's main discussion.
And something that I have a fair amount of experience with, having just spent the last year and a half on the same build. I mean, there's multiple little builds within it, but overall there's a vibe to the entire place, and it's large. And so thought that I could speak to this at length. But to build on what we said last week with the landscape stuff, I would suggest using the landscape. There are some specific situations where, yes, you want to do a bit of, excavation and whatnot. In our modern city on the Citadel, because of the way we wanted to build it, we ended up like flattening a lot of stuff. But in terms of a castle specifically, or anything that you want to look more natural in the landscape, no matter what it is, I would say use the land. So if you listened last week and you know where you want to build, I would suggest trying to remove as little of the landscape as possible. Giving yourself some boundaries does foster creativity and kind of say, okay, well, I want to build this thing, but there's this hill in the way. Do I build on top of the hill? Do I make an entrance in the hill and make the hill part of the building? Like what can you do for all that kind of stuff? For West Hill, the town that I'm building on the Citadel, I chose the location because there was a big western mountain that would provide a natural barrier, which means there was one less wall I had to build. But also through the plains biome, there was 2 or 3 rivers that snake through where I wanted to build. And I just thought that's a really cool opportunity to have the town divided by a river. The river could provide commerce in terms of like reasons for building near the river, and an opportunity to build bridges. I think I've got at least 3, if not 4 bridges right now in the entire city. So that kind of stuff kind of really helped, me choose that location and use the landscape, and the landscape informed what I was going to do. I needed those bridges, which means those needed roads, and all that kind of stuff. So when you're coming to projects like that, I feel like you want to just kind of like take into account the natural landscape and how that might like influence how you see it, like how you come into the area and experience the build, your first impression of the build. Like, are you coming over a hill? Are you coming down from a mountain? Are you coming out of a cave to reveal something? Are you going into a cave to reveal something, now that we're dealing with 118 and there's these massive caverns? I think utilizing the landscape that Minecraft gives you will cut down on the amount of work and the daunting task ahead of you,
Yeah, also helps give your builds a lot more character, because I find building stuff on a completely flat landscape leads to everything being a lot more dull. And especially since you are building for the sightlines of you walking around on this completely flat plain. So if you're building something on a hillside, there is a much more... It's much easier to have like one tower that rises up above the others because it starts on a higher elevation, and then if you're looking at that from the plains leading up to this mountain where your castle is, you'll be able to see that tower much more clearly at that angle. Whereas if you build a shorter tower on a flat kind of landscape, then it's just going to get lost behind some of the other things that are in the foreground. So, like, thinking about what's in the foreground, what's in the background from the angle you're going to be looking at it is pretty important. As far as using the landscape goes, I favor the approach of messing with the landscape like you're molding clay. Like, you can't add any more clay. You can subtract a little bit more if you need to, but I feel like shaping the landscape around something when you've decided what area you want to actually kind of flatten out a little bit and build around, and then having the dirt kind of form up around the outside of it a little bit makes it look a little bit more nestled into the landscape, allows for a little bit more character to build around there, and makes it feel like it's been there for longer because the terrain has effectively shifted a little bit since it was built. In the case of castles especially, that's usually worth knowing because castles are built to be there for a long time, and in many cases have been there for a long time in terms of the real-world castles that we can draw inspiration from. So that's a good start, is finding some terrain that you feel like you can shape a little bit around what you're planning to build instead of just erasing it entirely to build something a little more flat.
Yeah, that addition of like even just a couple of blocks at the bottom of a wall to make it look like it's got some dirt piled up against it, or vegetation like bushes and custom trees and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Nature definitely encroaches on all structures if they've been there for even a short period of time in the grand scheme, and it does mountains to your build to make it look a lot more natural and part of the world, as opposed to something that's been plopped out of creative, just kind of like bonk, dropped from the sky, that kind of thing. I mean, just think about the last time you've watched a tutorial on YouTube where the creative world was a super flat world. And
yeah,
he's like, well, the build looks cool, but it feels really out of context because there's nothing else around it.
Yes, that leads in really well to my next point, actually, which is that even though you're talking about doing this from a survival context, it's okay to build sections of this in a separate creative world first, and it's worth remembering that your creative world doesn't have to be a super flat. Like, I get that some people have sort of, honor systems about this kind of stuff, but if you wanted to, you can generate a clone of your same world seed with cheats enabled, build in the exact same spot you aim to build your survival castle, and just use that as a means to do trial and error on what you actually want this thing to look like. And that will save you time in survival, mostly because, you don't have to go through the trial and error effort of building and rebuilding something when you've got things like gravity and physics and a limited inventory for materials and that kind of stuff applying to what you're doing. And it will feel at first like you're building something twice if you build it in creative first and then rebuild it in survival, but that means you don't have to build it 4 times before it looks right when you're doing that stuff in survival. So I do think building sections in a separate creative world first can help a great deal, and it can also help you plan what materials you want to go into it, both from a block palette perspective and how much stone do I actually have to gather in order to make sure I can build these castle towers. Because when it comes to material gathering, if you're doing that in survival, over preparation is really important. It's always going to take more resources than you expect. You got 5 chests of stone already, get a 6th. Like, get a 7th if you can as well, because you will find places that will just disappear. And some of those places won't even be visible, but you will know they are there. So it's always going to take more resources than you expect unless you've built it so comprehensively in creative first that you can count the blocks or take a schematic. So I honestly recommend, if you're planning some stuff beforehand, if you do that in a creative world, it's going to make the survival build a little bit easier later. And, all of the survival kind of purists out there be damned. It's worth doing just to save yourself a little bit of time in the trial and error process, unless that's really what you're in it for in the first place.
And I'm glad you mentioned sections for creative stuff, because one of the reasons I don't build my stuff entirely in creative is because I don't want to do it twice. And there is something that I like about the on-the-fly design decisions to struggling with something in survival, or the reality in survival of most of the time this is going to be viewed from below the player perspective, and you fly around a lot in creative because it's easy. It allows you to see things from different angles very quickly, and you end up spending an awful lot of time on the top of that chimney that you can't see
Mm-hmm.
in a survival build. So doing sections, I think, is great. I did that a lot for the large Nether hub in our world on the Citadel, where I didn't recreate the entire hub, but I did so in like either eighths or quarters sections, where like I just wanted to know how tall the pillar had to be. Because I had limits, like I had a bedrock ceiling I had to work with, and I had a certain like Y level that the glass floor was on, and so much to go in between. And it's such a pain in the butt. It's too small of a space to fly around with Elytra, and there was no scaffolding at that point. So back in like 112, 113 when we were building
Mm-hmm.
this. So it became necessary to plan out parts of the build to save myself time and making costly, because I mean it's not hard to redo something in Minecraft. It just takes a long time, especially if you've built something very intricate. And so I wanted to avoid that. So I've done that thing where like I'll build, a 5x3 section of a wall and a tunnel, knowing on the server it's going to be repeated 100 times, right? But to get it right in creative, know what you need, know what looks good together, you can then prep for it that much easier. And nothing takes the wind out of your building sails like getting 2/3 of the way through something and realizing you don't have enough blocks to finish it, and you
Yeah,
have to
and
stop and go mine or whatever,
you need to go and chop trees for another 5 hours to get all of the wood that it turns out you
Yeah.
need, and then strip all of the logs when you put them in and that kind of thing. Yeah,
Yeah.
and like Joel is coming from from the perspective of somebody who's been building for a while and is already a trained artist, and like
Yeah.
you've got a lot of experience in that kind of field anyway. And I feel like as somebody who like our correspondent here is relatively new to building in Minecraft, we don't know much about their background. I feel like a lot of those kind of working in stages and trying to figure out what it is you like about things is all part of the process. And allow yourself to make mistakes and remember that anything you build can be rebuilt, which is a very intimidating thought at first, but then Minecraft allows us to make changes to everything we've done. And I find that like when it comes to researching stuff like this, there are so many different places to start. And, obviously knowledge of architecture or, some kind of ideas of form and shape from an art background are a bonus, but they're absolutely not essential. I think even like architects, they know a lot about the features of a building, but a lot of their job is making sure that whatever they're building doesn't collapse under its own weight, which is not a problem in Minecraft at all. So you can do janky floating floors and things that would never hold up in reality, the kind of thing that if you 3D printed them, it would just cave in on itself. Not a problem in game. So I think a lot of that stuff you can give yourself a little bit more creative freedom and creative license to just mess around with stuff. And as long as it looks good, you don't necessarily have to mimic real-world architecture as much. That said, if you do want to mimic real-world architecture, if you want something to look like it exists in the real world, research is the most important factor, I think. You start by borrowing and stealing information from everything, whether it's concept art that you found online, do a Google image search for stuff, IRL photo reference if you're able to go out and take pictures of something that you're building in your local area, even your local library. Everything is fair game when the project is just for yourself. You don't have to worry about plagiarizing people because it's your personal Minecraft world. They're never going to find it and they wouldn't care. So I think just grabbing as much reference material as you can will give you a ton of ideas to work from. And if that doesn't completely overwhelm you, you'll start to figure out, you can cherry pick like a tower here, a wall there, the kind of stuff that you want to emulate with your Minecraft build. And I've been gathering reference material of all kinds for stuff that I want to end up building in any of my Minecraft worlds, and it's helped me immensely since I started doing that.
I keep a Pinterest board of stuff that I find online, whether it's a model like a miniature, whether it's I don't follow a lot of other Minecraft builds because I don't want to end up copying those, and that's just a personal thing. For someone just starting out, absolutely find a build from your favorite Minecraft creator and rebuild it. You're going to learn a lot. by copying something.
We come at that from the context of being content creators and doing this stuff publicly on streams, on videos, that kind of stuff. And that might be an opinion that you hear a lot, that people don't want to steal what other people have done. Doesn't need to apply to you if you're not making commercial content out of your Minecraft stuff. Like, you don't need to worry about plagiarizing other creators at that stage.
We have had FWhip on the show in the past, and we'll have a link to their Pinterest board as well as my Pinterest board in the show notes for fun reference. Just kind of an idea of where to get started. They're excellent libraries of stuff to kind of really get you going quickly and spark some ideas. FWhip has got his stuff like categorized like castles and dwarven and desert and modern skyscrapers. Like, he's got it all sectioned out. I do as well, but he's got much more stuff. Also, concept art like artstation.com is something that I use quite a bit for just looking for inspiration. Sometimes I might not even use the reference, but just the idea of something hanging on a cliffside or being built like upside down, hanging from the ceiling, something like that might spark an idea for what I want to do. Heads up, sometimes artstation.com can be not safe for work. Not that it's lewd, it's just that it's an art site, so there might be figure drawing and things like that. But if you're looking for buildings, you're probably not going to run into too much of that. What I like to do is when you find a couple of images or you've got a couple of research bullet points that you've liked and you're going to go down that route, I like to make what I call a brain board or an art board. And so I'll take 5 or 6 images that I like. I'll use Photoshop. You can use whatever free software around. It's really not hard. You're just kind of cropping and making a collage of the images that you like and sticking them all in one easy to open image to have next to you, either on a tablet or on a second monitor or even just in the background, that you can refer to. And if you get to a point where you're confident enough where, you can combine ideas, or if you just can't find one single reference that does what you want, you can take the roof from one image, the tower from another, and the colors from a third, and it's Minecraft. You can kind of just combine them all. And having all that kind of stuff kind of in your peripheral while you're working will help you keep consistent with, scale and the visuals that you want to put forward. I find it super, super helpful. It keeps me focused and keeps me from making a build too complicated, because Minecraft has got a lot of blocks, right? But if you're looking at references and you're just like, no matter how cool I want to make this look, this reference image is basically gray and brown. It keeps you rooted in the idea of the project and forces some creativity in there to try and make it look authentic, which is going to communicate to either anybody that you show it to or just your experience in game that it is a castle or it is a specific build like a windmill or something, and that it doesn't look unlike what it's supposed to look like in the world. Because if you're going to represent something, like, you want it to kind of stick to those shape languages that are generally accepted as, like, yes, that's what a castle looks like, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think with castles we have so many different examples from history, from the real world, about things that you can draw information from, and I think the context of those is often really important. Like, if you're not put off by the restrictions of stuff like this, then you can take examples from why real-world castles were built there. Like, you build a castle on a hilltop because it's easier to defend, it has a good view of the area, and in our case, we can build cool-looking paths leading up to them. But there is a real-world reason to build a castle on top of a hill. If you haven't found the right hill, you want to build your castle in a valley, go ahead. Maybe it's a checkpoint for traders and travelers who want to enter the region. Like, ultimately, having a little bit of lore or story or purpose, just an excuse even for why you've built something there, is a good way to feel positive about your project. Is kind of like, and it can inform how things end up looking. Is your castle up there on the hill because they don't want people going up there? Like, you build the walls really high as a result to keep people out. The gate has to look massive and foreboding and scary to anybody who turns up. That informs a few of your design decisions. If you're not basing this on a real-world thing, you can start to make that stuff look the way it feels in the sort of vibe of the area. And that's all done through context, really.
Mm-hmm. So we've covered the where, we've covered the what, and now the why. So in terms of the how, like, you've got everything picked out, you know what you're doing and where you're doing it. what's your first step in planning out a large build?
It varies. That's the thing. Like on a large build, like the castle that I built in the last survival guide world, I ended up doing a series of like these are going to be the major structures, like the tower. There's going to be a gate here. This is where all of the walls go, and kind of draw some dotted lines around the landscape. You know, whether you're doing that with different colors to specify like this is where a certain type of building is going to go, or if you're just laying it all out with stone because you know stone is going to be the foundation block for all of that stuff. I find that drawing out effectively a blueprint of sorts is pretty helpful, and that is the stage at which it's a lot easier to move stuff around. If you decide that ultimately, no, that doesn't quite fit right, or that doesn't give me enough space for a courtyard here where I expected there to be some, or whatever, that is the stage at which you can still move things, and it's not going to mean taking down a few stacks of stone that you've built there and decided it's in the wrong place. You can do that later, of course. There's nothing stopping you, but it's just a lot less effort to do it then. And I feel like a lot of larger builds get more of their character from the shape of things than they do stuff like texture. So getting the shape right early is going to save you a lot of hassle further down the line.
I approach large projects like I approach a drawing, like my artwork. So there's a sketch, you refine the shapes, you double check your proportions, you tighten things up and make color selections. And then finally our textures, details, all that kind of stuff, the set dressing as you were. And I approached Minecraft the same way. Wireframes, like if you're building a house, build a box first. Don't put the entire wall up. You don't start. It's not like a Lego instruction manual, which we mentioned earlier in the show, where they do give you detailed instructions brick by brick about, you just have to trust that it's going to look good in the end. With Minecraft, I find, especially for large projects, you want to go with wireframes. And to your point in the email, don't use wool. It's a real pain to move later.
Yeah.
If you need to use colors to differentiate, what you're looking at, then go with concrete. Because you can use a beacon and remove concrete like super fast if you have to.
Yeah, or if it's concrete powder and it's affected by gravity, so that might be a concern. But you can shovel that with an efficiency shovel and it breaks instantly.
Yes, exactly. I just happen to have some good pickaxes and I can build a beacon easy enough. So I use things like diorite, granite, and cobble to quickly lay out the foundations in my town because I can see them very easily. Now, I'll have the giant asterisks of like, I use a map mod on the Citadel to help in this process. I can look straight down on this map and see my layout, and things like diorite show up super clear. So it's useful in that way. I don't build entire walls out of it because then I'd have to take it down or remove it. So I just build the wireframes. And so building in stages is really key. And I think another thing that I didn't anticipate when I was going into this, but I've learned from, is that take your time. Just because you have the wireframe done doesn't mean you have to immediately then fill in and finish that building. Build another wireframe next to it. Build the whole thing as a giant scaffolding wireframe and walk by it a couple times. Like as you're building the next stage, you're finishing the roof shape of one tower, have other things that you're walking by. Does anything make your eye twitch? Like, do you want to lower a tower because it's blocking the view of something cool behind it? Or did you realize that you've built these two towers too close together? You'd much rather walk in between them, or have a much wider road or something like that. I find that those things, to Pixelriff's point about being able to move something. I mean, nothing is more disheartening than having this really cool tower that's got like leaves hanging over the balcony and everything looks great, only to realize you really want it 3 blocks to the left. And it just, you have two decisions. You either move the tower or you move the rest of the whole build, and it's, you sometimes just have to do it, but you can avoid those kind of time intensive mistakes by planning things out in stages. What I find really nice about this approach for me is that even though it does involve a lot of rebuilding, now this is because I haven't done anything in creative, so kind of a point there. But case in point, like the stage I'm at with this build on the Citadel this weekend, I've put in the major kind of like swashes, the broad strokes, stone walls, very little detail, stone brick corners, dark oak roof. I've got no windows in the roof. I've got none of those kind of details, but it's just a broad stroke. Now, yes, if I had designed the windows in the roof ahead of time and I wanted to put them in right away, I could have. And it would have saved me from building the entire roof only to have, I have to cut holes in it now to put in the windows and adjust a lot of blocks. But I was more concerned about the height of the build and how it was going to look when it was all filled in and what it was going to block out. And I don't mind rebuilding stuff because at each stage, I'm only moderately increasing my time investment. So at any point, if I say, I need to make this roof lower, I'm going to be real glad I didn't take the time to add the windows in, only to realize that I have to shift them down a block, later on,
Mhm.
or they don't work, like they don't make sense if I've reduced the roof by 3 blocks or something drastic, and then there's no more room for windows. And so like, I'm glad that I didn't take the time to do that. For me, I feel like, um, in terms of the how, with the flying around in creative, you're going to want to look at things from a couple of vantage points. Sometimes you need to be high to see what's going on, specifically with like floor plans or building different, several buildings, the kind of blueprint that you'd look down on for a castle build. You'd want to be up high enough that you can understand that's tower, that's the main hall, this is the entrance, that's the wall, that kind of stuff. So build yourself either like a water elevator tower or a scaffolding tower, something that you can get up and down very easily. If you're at a stage in the game where you've got elytra, then maybe build yourself a nice little high dive platform or something that you can fly up to and land on easily and take a look at the build. You'll be happy that you did it later, where you're not having to constantly fly around and look at something while you're zooming by. It's very difficult to kind of assess the shape of a build when you're flying around. So find the roost that you can sit on. But don't fall into the trap of always looking at your stuff from above, because when it's done, chances are you're mostly going to be walking around and looking at it. And so taking a look at the castle or whatever it is you're building from street level, from ground level at various points in the area is going to be also informative as to what you build and where.
Yeah, and honestly, if you're building stuff like a castle, you're probably going to start building things like diagonal walls and curved walls, and there are going to be some sections like that that are going to feel really messy up close the first time you build stuff like that. Because you're building something larger, those will look a lot better viewed from a distance. The blockiness of stuff like that gets a lot less noticeable, in the same way that, like, when you're up close to one of the newer kind of cliff formations in 1.18, you go, wow, these are actually really square when you look at them, and there's like a couple of sections that look a little bit too kind of artificial and manufactured, but then you row away maybe 50 blocks, turn around and look at it, and you're like, wow, what an awesome looking cliff. And a lot of that is down to perspective, and like distance creates a certain amount of illusion where you can take in the full picture instead of just looking at one element up close. And that even applies to stuff like materials. Like, I've seen builders like BOO works things like, acacia wood and coal ore and things in to have a color gradient up one wall. And it's the kind of stuff that makes no sense up close. But if you look at it from a distance, it's got the right balance of color, and it starts to gradiate the darker grays into the lighter grays a little bit more. So oftentimes, regardless of materials, if you're working with stuff that's going to look good at a distance, you don't need to worry so much about the up-close detail unless you're planning to live there. And if you're planning on spending all of your time in the build and around it, then those little hidden details are going to mean something to you. And up-close detail is going to matter a lot more, and it's going to take a lot more time to build in stuff like that. But if it basically exists just to look pretty from a distance and is not a practical build for stuff you want to do in your Minecraft world, then you don't need to worry as much about stuff like interiors, routes around the build, and those kind of little hidden details that nobody's ultimately going to see. If you're flying past it and you spot one of those things, then it's there for a fraction of a second and then it's gone again, and you don't really need to worry about it as much. If you want the build to feel more complete over time, then that's something you can spend time on later, but ultimately throughout this process you should be giving it time. Rome wasn't built in a day is the popular saying, but that's also, I think, wouldn't be the case in Minecraft even with a solid build team. Imagining building the entire city of Rome although that could be a challenge idea for one of the bigger professional build studios out there. But the reason, going back to what you said in your email, most of the build tutorials you see on YouTube are in creative mode is because of time constraints. It's much more effective for people to provide an overview than it is to make an entertaining video out of the, 10 plus hours of real time it would take to build some of this stuff in survival. And that's assuming that you've gathered all the materials beforehand. I ended up doing a castle build that I mentioned in the original Minecraft survival guide world. That was a week's worth of videos for me. It ended up feeling about 60% complete when I moved on from it, and I just didn't ever really go back and finish out a lot of the detail. But I made a lot of mistakes. I learned a whole lot. I immediately wanted to build another castle when I got done with that one, but I just couldn't justify turning that into more video content. And it feels like a great opportunity to learn and plan some of that stuff and figure out what you liked about the process, what you could have done better. So honestly, there is something to be said for just throwing yourself into a project and doing it and giving yourself license to make mistakes, because if you don't feel like looking at it afterwards, you can move somewhere else in your Minecraft world. We like to say the world outside is infinite, and that is no more the case than when you want to get away from a completely ugly build that you've decided you don't like anymore. But the other thing you can do is give it more context. If there is a castle up there, then the castle has a purpose. That purpose is often to either protect or, oversee a town. And if you start building some other stuff around it later, you can find that a lot of the stuff that adds context to a build like that will disguise the fact that you might not be as happy with the build itself. If you're happy with the town that you end up building around it or in front of it, then that can pull a little bit of focus and the castle can still be there in the background, but it's like a movie set where the stuff in the background doesn't matter as much, and you start to suspend your disbelief that that's just a painting on a backdrop that they've got around the outside, or that it's a green screen effect that's out of focus because they don't want to see like how artificial it is in the first place. So you can disguise a lot of that stuff later if you don't end up as happy with it. But, putting a bunch of time into it beforehand is going to make sure that you are happy with it.
That brings me to my last artistic point, which is composition. And it sounds like a funny thing to talk about when you're dealing with a Minecraft build, which is essentially like making a miniature or a model. But one of the things that will save you time, also cover up parts of your build that you feel might be a little bit repetitive or boring, is the idea of thinking like an artist when composing a painting, or a cinematographer when composing a shot for a film. And that is you want to focus the eye of whoever is experiencing the build. So if the most important thing of the castle build is your front gate, and even though you want it to be big and you've got these walls that extend to the left and the right, but they're kind of boring, put a tree in front of them. Put something in there in the world to create perspective, create scale, and focus, and make the person experiencing the build going, well, that's just a tree, but man, this front gate, it's the only thing that I can see around here that's worth looking at. And that's good. That's what you want them to do. You want them to look at your exciting front gate, not the boring wall that goes for 100 blocks in both directions. That kind of stuff. Also, wipes or reveals, the idea of coming around a corner where you cannot see this really cool tower on the castle until you're around a corner. And then it's kind of like, bam, smacking you in the face. Castles often have courtyards or Pick said, towns around them. So you can create buildings and have roads that wind and show you a completely different scene until you turn the corner, and all of a sudden, wow, then you're faced with this castle that's framed by the road and framed by the small buildings on either side of you, meaning you only are looking at this giant, we'll say, white castle in the background versus these darker houses that are in front of you. So you can play with stuff like that to help focus the gaze of your player, yourself, or whatever you're experiencing. Think about it like a game designer sometimes, and just kind of approach it in that way. I feel like that is probably one of the best tools that you can have, because I get frustrated with the lack of, we'll say, block selection sometimes in Minecraft, where I want to add more texture, but it's not worth it for my time investment, for the fact that I'm never next to these things. They're you said, viewed from a distance, but it makes me frustrated that I have to look at them all the time. So I'm not there in a lot of ways on the West Hill build, but eventually there will be some houses and farms and trees and stuff in front of this town, so it doesn't look like it's just kind of plunked,
Mm-hmm.
on the landscape. But the other thing is, I talk a lot on the show about the 70-30 rule, which is the 30% detail, 70% rest for the eye. And while that is something that you can easily apply to a single build like a house, you can also apply it to an entire area. If you look at a town or a castle, castles are mostly walls, right? They're mostly towers and walls. Towns, mostly roofs. So my roofs in West Hill, pretty boring. They're
Mm-hmm.
they're a place for the eye to rest. I'm not putting crazy textures. I'm not doing all kinds of stuff. They're mostly the same color, couple of different things here and there to make it more interesting, but it's mostly kind of like basic stuff. All of my detail are in the first 4 blocks, the stuff that you see at player level, right? Street, entrances, gables, that kind of stuff. So with castles, most of your details are going to be in like windows and wall dressings and towers and minuets and stuff. Your walls are going to be fairly simple, and that's okay, because it gives a chance for the eye to rest as you're looking at the build.
We have fired a lot of advice at you, so
Yes.
I hope you are prepared for this kind of response to that email. But thank you for the email. We really appreciate it, and I'm sure there are tons of people with more building advice out there. Always happy to hear from you. Of course, if you have more questions, if you have more resources to share, we love to hear it here at the Spawn Chunks. But that is going to be wrapping up our episode for today. You can find more information about the show and links to some of the stuff that we've talked about today at thespawnchunks.com. The music for the show is composed by me, and the Spawn Chunks is proud as ever to be a listener-supported podcast. If you're getting some value out of the show, why not consider putting some value back in? You can do that at patreon.com/thespawnchunks. Pledging at any level gets you an invite to our patrons-only Discord chat, where you can listen to the show live and join our community of enthusiastic Minecraft fans. It also gets us closer to our next milestone goals, which at the time of this recording we have hit. We'll see how things settle up as February begins, but we are currently at 330 patrons, which is up 5 from last week, and we're pretty sure this is the most patrons we've ever had. So thank you all for your continued support, and special thanks go out to our content engineer patrons, Hunter555, Jumbo Sale, and Yitz for your support on this episode.
Sharing the podcast with your friends is the easiest way to support the show. You can find us at The Spawn Chunks on Twitter and Instagram. Personal recommendations are by far the best way to share the podcast. Just poke a friend in the arm from a safe distance and tell them that they should listen to The Spawn Chunks, and they can find it on iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and even YouTube. You can email the show at spawnchunkmail@gmail.com. The RSS feed is linked on the spawnchunks.com, and the patron-only RSS feed is on the Patreon page. That's where you can listen to the render distance, the extended version of the podcast.
My name is Johnny, but online I go by Pixel Riffs. You can find most of what I do at youtube.com/pixelriffs, where I try to make sense of this bizarre and wonderful game in Season 2 of the Minecraft Survival Guide. I also stream 3 days a week on Twitch, doing behind-the-scenes work for the aforementioned YouTube series, and occasionally participating in big events like Clash of the Creators. I'm the voice of the unofficial Hermitcraft recap, which is still on a break, but you can find us through a quick YouTube search if you want to browse the back catalogue. And aside from that, I'm at Pixel Riffs on both Twitter and Instagram. Joel, where can people find you online?
Everything I'm doing online, including my illustration and design portfolio, is at joelduggan.com. You can listen to my other podcast, The Citadel Cafe, which is about sci-fi and fantasy entertainment, at thecitadelcafe.com. Stephen ESC, a server member of mine, is going to be back this Wednesday. I'm not sure what we're going to be talking about, probably Star Wars. You can find me at Joel Duggan on social media and Joel Duggan on Twitch, where on Fridays I'm playing Olive Fabric 5, the mod pack that I've put together, or added to, I should say, as well as on weekends I am working on the Citadel.
Thanks for visiting the Spawn Chunks. The world outside is infinite, so we all have room to build bigger.